I felt the hardwood floor bite into my knees before I understood what my mother-in-law had actually said to me. "Kneel," Diane Whitmore repeated, her voice flat and pleasant, like she was asking someone to pass the gravy. "And apologize for sitting at the head of this table like you belong there." I was 31 years old. I was a captain in the United States Army Judge Advocate General's Corps, stationed at Fort Caldwell, North Carolina. I had briefed general officers. I had stood in a courtroom and argued a case in front of a military judge without my voice shaking once. And I was on my knees, on a Persian rug in a dining room in Charlotte, apologizing to a 74-year-old woman in pearls for the crime of existing at her table, while my husband stared down at his plate and said absolutely nothing. My phone buzzed against my thigh. Unknown number, area code local to the city where my late father-in-law's attorney kept her office. I didn't answer it. Not yet. I didn't know yet that the voicemail she was about to leave would end up rewriting who owned $4 million of land, or that in 6 weeks, I would be the one asking Diane Whitmore to leave a house that had her name on the mailbox but, as it turned out, had never actually been hers at all. "I'm waiting, Elena," Diane said. I looked up at her from the floor, and I said, "Okay." I want to back up, because you need to understand how we got to that floor. I met Daniel Whitmore 9 years ago at a friend's wedding in Savannah, back when I was a second lieutenant fresh out of law school and he was finishing his MBA. He was easy to love, funny in a self-deprecating way, quick to apologize when he was wrong, the kind of man who remembered which coffee order belonged to which of my friends after meeting them exactly once. We married 4 years later in a small ceremony his mother called rushed, though we dated for 3 years by then. Daniel's family had money, old money, the kind that came from his grandfather Walter Whitmore's construction business and 40 years of shrewd land purchases outside Charlotte that were now worth, conservatively, $4 million. Walter was the one Whitmore I genuinely loved without complication. He called me counselor as a joke, and he was the only person in that family who ever asked me questions about my work and actually waited for the answer. Diane, Daniel's mother, was different. She was polished in the way people are when politeness is a weapon they've sharpened for decades. Richard, Daniel's father, was quiet. The kind of quiet that I initially mistook for gentleness and later understood was something closer to exhaustion. He had a habit of turning his wedding ring around and around on his finger whenever Diane raised her voice, like a man counting down a clock only he could see. The warning signs were there before I ever knelt on that floor. 6 months into our marriage, at a dinner much like the one I've described, Diane told me, in front of everyone, that military wives who kept their careers were playing house with a uniform. I laughed it off. Daniel squeezed my hand under the table and texted me later that night. "She doesn't mean it the way it sounds. She's from a different generation. I'll talk to her." He never did. That became the pattern. Diane would say something designed to draw blood. Daniel would apologize for her privately, and nothing would ever actually change. Walter died 8 months before that dinner where I hit my knees. Congestive heart failure, quiet, in his sleep, at 81. I flew back from a training rotation to be at the funeral. I remember Diane in black Chanel, dry-eyed, already fielding calls from a realtor about the property less than a week after we buried him. I remember thinking that was strange. I didn't know yet how strange. What I also didn't know What almost nobody knew was that 6 weeks before he died, Walter Whitmore had called me alone into his study, closed the door, and asked me a question that would eventually save everything. "Elena," he'd said, sliding a folder across his desk toward me, "you're the only one in this family who reads before she signs." Now let me take you back into that dining room, because the kneeling wasn't the beginning of the cruelty. It was the middle of it. To understand why I stayed on that floor instead of standing up and walking out the door, you have to understand everything that came before it. The first 18 months of my marriage to Daniel were, if I'm honest, genuinely good. Diane's comments were sharp but occasional, easy enough to file away as, "That's just how she is." Richard was warm to me in his quiet way, once slipping me $200 in cash for gas money during a long TDY separation from Daniel, refusing to let Diane see. Walter adored me openly, which I later understood infuriated Diane more than she ever let on. The shift happened after Daniel's first overseas deployment as a contractor supporting a logistics company, 6 months in the Middle East, right around the time Walter's health started declining. With Daniel gone, Diane had unfiltered access to me, and she used it. She began showing up at our house unannounced, checking on the property, rearranging things in rooms that weren't hers. She told mutual friends at church that I was cold and distant with Daniel's family, that I'd pressured him into marrying quickly, that military life had made me hard to reach. I didn't hear about most of this until months later from Daniel's cousin, who mentioned it thinking I already knew. I didn't. That was the first reveal. Diane had been quietly building a narrative about me to the people who loved Daniel most, brick by brick, while I was 3,000 miles away doing my job. I confronted her once, carefully, the way you're trained to when you know you're dealing with someone smarter than they let on. "Diane, I heard you told the Andersons I pressured Daniel into eloping." She smiled at me over her wine glass. "I only tell people what I observe, Elena. If it upsets you, perhaps examine why." That was Diane's gift. She never lied outright. She curated. I should have written that conversation down. I didn't know yet how much it would matter later. When Walter's health began failing in earnest, Diane's attention on the estate sharpened into something I can only describe as hunger. She started attending his doctor's appointments alone, without Richard, without Daniel, insisting she was just being supportive. She began referring to the land, 4 parcels totaling almost $4 million in value, sitting on the edge of Charlotte's growth corridor, as my inheritance, months before Walter had died, in front of Richard, who said nothing, just turned his ring. It was around this time that Walter called me into his study. I remember the room smelled like cedar and old paper. He looked smaller than he had a year earlier, his hands thinner, but his eyes were sharp as ever. "I've watched my wife's family lose everything, twice, to people who smiled at the dinner table," he told me. "I'm not going to let it happen a third time." He told me he'd noticed Diane going through his financial documents when she thought he was asleep. He told me he'd caught her, 6 weeks earlier, trying to get him to sign a power of attorney document she'd had drawn up by a lawyer none of us knew, one he'd never agreed to hire. He'd refused to sign it, and instead, quietly, without telling Diane, Richard, or even Daniel, he'd had his real estate attorney, a woman named Grace Bellamy, sharp-eyed, unhurried, the kind of lawyer who read every clause twice, draft new deed transfer paperwork. "I'm putting the land in your name, Elena," he told me. "Not Daniel's, not held jointly. Yours. You're the only one who'll protect it and still do right by this family when I'm gone. I told him I couldn't accept that it wasn't my place, that Daniel was his grandson. He held up a hand. It's already done. Grace has the paperwork. It's notarized, it's filed, it's legal. I'm not asking your permission, counselor. I'm telling you what I did. He made me promise not to tell Diane. Not yet. Not until it mattered. She'll find a way to fight it if she has time to prepare, he said. Let her find out when it's already finished. I didn't fully understand, in that moment, how right he was. I signed nothing that day. I didn't need to. The deed was already filed under my name, sitting quietly in a county records office, waiting. Walter died 2 months later, and that's when Diane's mask started slipping in earnest. At the funeral reception, Diane pulled me aside and told me, with a smile so calm it made my skin crawl, that she'd already spoken to a realtor about the parcels, that she wanted the transition handled quickly, out of respect for Walter's wishes. I said nothing. I didn't yet know what I owned. Grace Bellamy hadn't called me back yet to confirm the filing was final. 3 weeks later, Diane discovered, I still don't know exactly how, though I have theories involving a county clerk she golfed with, that the land wasn't in Walter's estate to distribute at all. It had already been transferred to me, months before his death. That's when the dinners changed. The first real incident came 2 weeks after that discovery, at a family dinner Diane had specifically requested, with Daniel, newly back from his contract overseas, Richard present, and, unusually, Daniel's cousin and aunt invited too. An audience I now understand Diane had assembled on purpose. Halfway through the meal, Diane set down her fork with theatrical precision and said, I think it's time Elena explained to this family why she stole her husband's inheritance out from under a dying old man. I remember Daniel's fork freezing halfway to his mouth. I remember his face. Not anger at his mother, but confusion aimed at me, like I was the one who'd done something wrong. Elle, what is she talking about? I told him the truth, carefully, the way you present facts you know will be twisted the moment they leave your mouth. Walter had transferred the deed to me, legally, before he died, of his own free will, because he didn't trust his daughter-in-law with it. No, because he trusted me. I never used the word trust about Diane. Diane did that for me. He was heavily medicated in his final months, Diane said with practiced hurt. Anyone with a law degree could talk an old man into signing something he didn't understand. The lie landed exactly where she wanted it to. Daniel's cousin gasped audibly. Richard stared at his plate. That was the second major reveal, layered directly on top of the first. Not just that Diane had been slandering me to the family for over a year, but that she was now willing to imply in front of witnesses that I had committed elder manipulation against a man who had loved me more honestly than she ever had. Walter had told me she'd fight dirty. I hadn't understood yet what dirty actually meant for Diane Whitmore. That night, after everyone left, Daniel and I fought for the first time in our marriage in a way that scared me. Not because he raised his voice, he never did, but because of what he asked me. Why didn't you tell me he was giving it to you? Why would you keep that from your own husband? I told him I'd promised Walter. He said, You should have told me anyway. You should have picked me over a promise to a dead man. I remember sitting on the edge of our bed that night thinking, this is the moment I find out whether my husband can think for himself or whether his mother has already decided the answer for him. He apologized the next morning, brought me coffee, said he'd been in shock, said he believed me. The calm lasted 11 days. I want to give you a breath here, because that period of my life wasn't only crisis. I still had a job to do. 2 weeks after that fight, I was back at Fort Caldwell prepping a court-martial case, a straightforward larceny charge against a young specialist who'd stolen from the unit fund. I remember sitting in my office at 0630, reviewing evidentiary chain of custody documents, and thinking how strange it was that I could hold a courtroom to a standard of proof that my own family refused to apply to me. In that job, if you claimed something, you had to show your work. At Diane's table, feelings were evidence enough. I finished the specialist's case in 4 days. He pled down to a lesser charge with restitution. It was, oddly, the calmest week I had that entire spring. Then came the second dinner, the kneeling dinner. Diane had invited us over under the pretense of clearing the air as a family. What actually happened was an ambush. She'd actually printed on cream cardstock like an invitation, a document she called a family reconciliation agreement, which asked me to voluntarily transfer the deed back into the family's name, meaning hers, in exchange for what she called peace at the table. When I declined to sign it, calmly, citing that the land was legally mine and the matter would need to go through Grace Bellamy if there were concerns, Diane stood up from her chair, walked around the table, and told me that in her house, at her table, disrespect wasn't tolerated, and that I would apologize for my tone. I told her I hadn't raised my voice. Then apologize for existing like you own something you didn't earn, she said. Kneel and say it. And Daniel, my husband, the man who once memorized my friend's coffee orders, said nothing. He looked at his plate. Richard turned his ring. And I knelt. Not because I believed I owed her anything, but because in that half second I made a decision that would matter more than my pride. I decided to let her keep believing she'd won, while I quietly recorded every word of it in my head, the way I'd been trained to preserve testimony. My phone buzzed in my pocket as I came back up off my knees. It was the third call that day from the same unknown number. I called it back from the car in the driveway, Daniel still inside, still silent. It was Grace Bellamy. "Captain Vasquez," she said, "I've been trying to reach you. We have a problem, but it's not the one you think." Grace told me that Diane, believing she still had leverage over an unfiled or informal version of the deed, had gone to a different attorney 3 weeks earlier and filed a quitclaim deed attempting to transfer the property from herself to herself as executor, a document that required, at minimum, her being a party with legal standing to the property, which she was not, and a notarization that, upon Grace's review, appeared to bear a stamp from— "She forged it," I said. "She forged it," Grace confirmed. "And she used it to secure a $180,000 bridge loan against parcel value she does not own, using your father-in-law's signature as a co-guarantor." "Elena, did Richard know about this loan?" I didn't know. That was the fourth reveal, and it was about to become the fifth. I called Colonel Hastings that night. Not my chain of command exactly, but my mentor since my first assignment. A man who'd talked me through harder decisions than this one. I laid it out for him at his kitchen table over black coffee at 9 at night, and he listened the way he always did, without interrupting, until I finished. "Vasquez," he said finally, "you're not wrong, but you'd better be right, and you'd better be able to prove it, because the second you go after that woman, she is going to try to burn the whole family down to save herself. What does your lawyer say? Get the forensic document examiner. Get the notary registry pulled. Don't confront her until you have paper, not feelings." "And Daniel?" Hastings set his mug down. "You can't make a man choose his wife over his mother. You can only make it impossible for him to keep pretending he doesn't have to." I didn't know that within a week, I wouldn't have to make Daniel choose anything. He'd choose on his own, just not in the way I expected. The following Tuesday, Richard Whitmore called me, not Daniel. Richard, who I don't think had called my phone directly in 9 years of marriage. His voice was different than I'd ever heard it, steady in a way his silence at dinner tables had never let me see. "Elena," he said, "I need you to meet me. Not at the house. Somewhere Diane won't hear about it." We met at a diner off Providence Road. He slid a folder across the table to me, the same gesture Walter had made in his study 8 months earlier, and for a moment, I almost couldn't breathe. "I found this in her desk," he said. "I want you to know I didn't sign that loan guarantee. That's not my signature. I've been married to that woman for 38 years, and I know my own handwriting, and I know hers when she's trying to imitate someone else's. She's been doing this a long time, Elena. Small things. I told myself it was small things." His hand shook slightly as he turned his ring one more time and then, deliberately, stopped. "I'm done pretending I don't see it." Inside the folder was a second forged signature, Richard's, on a home equity application from 3 years earlier, one he'd never known existed until he went looking after the family dinner where I'd knelt on the floor and he'd finally felt the shame of having watched it happen without moving. That was the 5th reveal, the one that finally cracked the case wide open. Richard hadn't just been a passive bystander to Diane's cruelty toward me. He'd been a target of her fraud for years and had simply never looked closely enough to see it, until the sight of his son's wife on her knees made him look. We didn't confront Diane that week. Grace Bellamy insisted on doing it properly, pulling the notary registry records, hiring a forensic document examiner to compare signatures, subpoenaing the loan file from the bank that had issued the bridge loan against the forged deed. It took 11 days. 11 days of Diane calling me twice daily with a saccharine friendliness that made my stomach turn, clearly believing she had successfully cornered me into silence. The confrontation happened in Grace Bellamy's conference room, not a dining room, on a Thursday afternoon in October. Diane arrived in pearls, expecting, I think, a negotiation. Daniel sat beside me, not beside his mother, for the first time in this entire ordeal, though his jaw was tight and his eyes wouldn't meet mine yet. Richard sat across the table, his ring finally still. Grace opened the folder and, without raising her voice, without a hint of theater, read the findings aloud. The deed transferring the property to me, executed and notarized 11 weeks before Walter Whitmore's death, fully valid under North Carolina law. The quitclaim deed Diane had filed afterward, bearing a notary stamp registered to a woman who had retired from notary service 4 years earlier and had never notarized a single document in the state that year. The bridge loan application bearing Richard's forged signature, confirmed by an independent forensic examiner. And finally, the piece Diane clearly hadn't anticipated. Bank records showing that the $180,000 from that fraudulent loan had already been partially spent. $40,000 on a renovation to Diane's own kitchen, $60,000 transferred to an account in her name alone that Richard had never known existed. Diane's face, for the first time in 9 years of knowing her, actually changed. Not to remorse, to calculation. And then, when she realized the math wasn't working in her favor, to fury. "This family owes me that land," she said, voice rising for the first time I'd ever heard it rise in public. "I raised that boy. I built this family. She's been in it 9 years and suddenly it's hers?" "It was never yours to begin with, Diane," Richard said. It was the first time in the entire ordeal he had spoken directly to her in front of other people, and it landed like a gavel. Grace closed the folder. "The county recorder's office has already been notified of the fraudulent filing. The bank has been notified of the forged guarantor signature. What happens next is a legal matter, not a family one." That's when the second twist surfaced, the one none of us saw coming, not even Grace. 2 days after that meeting, the forensic examiner Grace had hired called with an update. The same forged notary stamp appeared on a third document, filed 18 months earlier, involving a small trust account that had belonged to Daniel's late grandmother, Walter's first wife, who had died when Daniel was a teenager, years before Diane married into the family as Walter's second wife. Diane had apparently been quietly diverting small distributions from that trust for years, believing no one would ever cross-reference the paperwork. Daniel hadn't known the trust still existed. Neither had Richard. It wasn't Elena's money, wasn't Richard's, wasn't even directly related to the estate fight. But it proved something none of us could argue with anymore. This wasn't one bad decision made in grief or desperation. It was a pattern, years long, and Elena's estate had simply been the largest fish Diane had ever tried to land. Diane Whitmore was charged with forgery, uttering a forged instrument, and financial exploitation of a vulnerable adult, a charge that applied because Walter, in his final year, had legally qualified as vulnerable under the statute, and because 2 of her earliest attempts at manipulating his finances had occurred while he was recovering from a cardiac procedure. She pled guilty eventually, rather than risk trial, to reduced charges that still carried real weight. 18 months, with the possibility of parole after serving a portion. Full restitution ordered on the bridge loan, and a permanent civil judgment barring her from any further claim on the Whitmore estate or the old trust. She showed no remorse at sentencing. When the judge asked if she had anything to say, she looked directly at me and said, "I still don't think I did anything a mother wouldn't do to protect her family." The judge did not find that persuasive. Neither, finally, did anyone else in that courtroom. Richard's path was different, because Richard's wrongs had been wrongs of silence, not of malice. He cooperated fully with the investigation, testified against Diane without hesitation despite 38 years of marriage, and in the months afterward began showing up, actually showing up, in ways he never had before. He came to my promotion ceremony when I made major the following spring, stood in the front row in a suit that didn't quite fit anymore because he'd lost weight from the stress of that year. And afterward, he pulled me aside and said simply, "I should have turned that ring on my finger the other direction a long time ago. I'm sorry it took this to make me look." I don't think Richard will ever fully forgive himself. But I've forgiven him, because watching a man finally choose to see something he spent decades avoiding is its own kind of courage, even if it came late. Daniel and I nearly didn't survive that year. There was a period, right after the conference room confrontation, when he needed space to grieve the mother he thought he'd had versus the one the evidence had revealed. We went to counseling together, twice a week for 4 months. The turning point for us came the night he finally said, unprompted, "I think some part of me always knew, and I let you carry the weight of proving it because it was easier than admitting what my own family was." That wasn't an excuse. It was the first honest thing he'd said about his mother in 9 years. And it was enough for me to believe we could rebuild something real on top of it. Grace Bellamy, who had quietly protected that deed for nearly a year before any of us knew how much it would matter, became our family's permanent counsel afterward, and I made sure, publicly, at a dinner that finally felt like what a family dinner should, to tell everyone present exactly how much we owed her steady, unglamorous diligence. She waved it off the way people who are actually excellent at their jobs tend to. "Walter did the hard part," she told me. "He just needed someone to file the paperwork correctly and keep her mouth shut until it mattered, just 3 months away." Everything sped up. Vendor deposits, dress fittings, and Chelsea inserting herself into every single detail, helping with seating charts, helping pick out Marcus's tux, always finding reasons to be alone with him, for wedding stuff. 1 year later, Daniel and I still live on that land. Not in Diane's old house, but in a smaller one we built ourselves on the back parcel, overlooking the same fields Walter used to walk with me on Sunday afternoons, back when he called me counselor and meant it as the highest compliment he had. We turned 2 of the 4 parcels into a land trust in Walter's name, preserving them instead of selling to developers, which is what I think he actually wanted all along, more than he ever wanted any of us fighting over the money. Richard visits most Sundays now. He and Daniel talk more than they ever did when Diane filled every silence in that family with something sharp. I made major in the spring. Daniel started therapy on his own, not because I asked him to the second time, but because he wanted to understand why he'd stayed quiet for so long. I think about that dining room floor sometimes, the exact second I decided to kneel instead of walk out. I used to wonder if that was weakness. I don't think that anymore. Sometimes, the strongest thing you can do is let someone believe they've won for exactly as long as it takes you to prove, in writing, on paper, in a courtroom, that they never actually did. Diane Whitmore spent a year telling this family who I was. In the end, all it took was a deed with my name already on it, signed and filed and true, to tell them who I'd actually been the entire time. If this story meant something to you, if you've ever had to hold your ground quietly while someone tried to convince the whole room you didn't belong there, I'd love to hear about it in the comments. And if you want more stories like this one, stick around and subscribe, because there are more women out there who knelt once and never again.